There was the tough kid in the Sudbury lumber camp, the patrician family lad in the Caribbean, a Quebecois trapper's baby girl, 3 young brothers from Maniwaki, an Armenian boy orphaned when Turkish forces razed his town, a Toronto jeweler's daughters, the German-born sparring partner of the mighty Bob Fitzsimmons, a young Russian laborer, and the sons of a mine-finding prospector, Fred Bidgood, who once sold one of them. Their disparate lifelines of these and others would converge on a plateau of sand over northwestern Quebec granite incongruously called the Valley of Gold. 2 of Val-d'Or's lifelines began in the last century in Germany, and in Georgia, Russia. August Balsmer and Mike Middow. Their paths first crossed in 1920 in Prince Rupert, in northwestern British Columbia. At the other end of nowhere, the mouth of the Skeena River where hard rock and cold sea met, the new boomtown needed hand-sawing, steel-driving, shovel-heaving men as rugged as the land itself. One day, 2 groups of those men ended up in the same restaurant. The obvious leader of one group was Mike Middow, who had arrived alone in North America as a 17-year-old Russian immigrant and worked his way across the continent as if seeking space and challenges for his bull-shouldered bulk. Short-legged, thick-muscled, heavy-chested, with a low center of gravity, he'd made as much as $40 in piecework moving ore in the mines when the average miner would take only 7 King George bills back to the bunkhouse. And he was a steel-driving star. On that part of the Saskatchewan-Manitoba border delightfully named Flin Flon, alter the fictional character Fawzia Flinabady Flon Aden, he took the $100 prize tour years running sledging a steel bit into the granite, once, a U.S. magazine reported breathlessly at the astounding rate of 21.5 inches in 10 minutes. The leader of the other group in that steak and beans cafe was August Balsmer, the man from Germany. Although he was always called the Russian Kid, a nickname from his boxing days, he went to school in the U.S. and did know some Russian, but Kid was an odd moniker for this 230 pounds of perfectly proportioned 6'3". Like Middow, his reputation preceded him into that Pacific Coast cafe. Years later, Nelson Bidgood, a veteran of every Canadian prospecting frontier, recalled the giant Russian Kid. He was quiet and well-behaved, but if anyone stepped on his toes, God help them. You just had to look at the Russian Kid or talk to him for 5 minutes and you sensed the potential deadliness of the man. But he never interfered with anyone, didn't go looking for trouble. Pause, time groping. The stories are hidden in the mist. But the man did have a background of violence. The 2 groups of frontier roustabouts in that Prince Rupert cafe were egging their respective champions into a challenge arm wrestling match. Neither had ever come out on the wrong end of a barroom fight, sized each other up across the room. The Russian Kid eventually heaved out of his chair and walked over to Middow's table. The only sound in the cafe was the scrape of hobnailed boots and chair legs as everyone tuned to watch. The Kid towered over the table, looking down at the broad Slavic face of Mike Middow, who retuned the look, heavy-lidded, expressionless. Finally, the Kid said, "You look Russian." The thick calloused fingers of one of Middow's hands levered a cap off a beer bottle. "Yeah. From Georgia." The Kid grinned. "Tovarich," he bellowed. 2 big hands clasped, not to arm wrestle, but to shake the start of a continent-spanning prospecting partnership that lasted until a day between Christmas and New Year's, 1938. The night before, though he'd been nursing a bad cold, he had helped fight a Val-d'Or house fire in freezing weather. He'd come home to Mike and his sister, who'd become Mrs. Middow, saying he didn't feel very well. Then while Mike was gone to get medicine for him, the Russian Kid, only 58, died in bed. The colorful prospecting team was known wherever gold fever struck, across the continent and high into the Arctic. They made fortunes, lost and made them again. Within a couple of years of their meeting, they'd be discovering gold inside the Quebec border, edging their way, with side trips to other gold fields, to what was to become Val-d'Or. At one point they turned down $1 million deal for that Quebec property known as El Coco and the Russian Kid Mine, and later as Bordulac. To one offer for the Das Erat Township claims where the Kid and Mike had manhandled away the heavy overburden to reveal the gold-bearing quartz, the Russian Kid barked, "That's a deal?" You know who you're talking to? Russian kid, that's who. All you're asking me to do is to sell my rear end and fart through my ribs. Neither the Russian kid nor Mike were just muscle men. Both learned how to read geological signs, exploit their claims, and deal with engineers and promoters. Mike, his son Ogie said, could write his name and read a little, but his big partner was respected as an educated man. In the early Val d'Or camp, there were many immigrants who'd missed school because they had to start work. In his pool room and gaming club, Mike later took it over. The Russian kid was bouncer and news announcer. Men would gather around and he would read the world news from a Toronto paper. The political and economic turmoil of the old countries were the catalysts that moved many to North America and, ultimately, Val d'Or, revolutions in Russia, the first U.S. invasion of Cuba, the Boer War, the Boxer Uprising, and the Russo-Japanese War. Among the million Armenians slaughtered by the Turks were the parents of a baby boy who would patronize the Russian Kids Club in Val d'Or. When Turkish soldiers torched his village, shooting villagers who hadn't died in the flames, little Magopian, son of Hagop or Jacob, somehow survived. He was rescued by missionaries and, eventually, was one of 100 orphan boys brought to Canada by an Armenian relief agency, led by Toronto carpet merchant, Levon Babian. The boys were well looked after, fed, clothed, and schooled, but their youthful lives had been shaped in tragedy and turmoil. Some, including young Hagopian, later tagged with a good Canadian name, Mackenzie, could not settle down. He ran away. Idly shuffling a deck of cards, Blackie, Mackenzie, said pensively, "The only thing I regret ever doing is running away from Babian. I didn't know what I was doing, didn't know the meaning of money." The wealthy, and childless, Babians had wanted to adopt him. His route to Val d'Or led him through farm fields, to restaurant dishwashing sinks, into an Ottawa Valley paper mill, regularly into the card deal and dice throw, and, to the elm-shaded streets of Williamsburg near the St. Lawrence River south of Ottawa. It was the village home of Malin William Locke, then the world's most famous physician, the foot doctor. He was the inventor of the Locke shoe and of a chiropractic foot manipulation treatment particularly beneficial, for arthritis sufferers. The poor, the rich, and the famous from around the world carned to his home. Blackie, Dr. Locke gave him his nickname, became one of the youths who helped patients in wheelchairs. Once I wheeled Lionel Barrymore, and lived in the big two-story born with Locke, his wife, and young children. I learned a lot from the doctor. I was his favorite among the boys. I even learned his trade. Ogie, Mike Mitto's son, will vouch for that. Christ, tell you. Couple of nights I couldn't walk, my foot swollen up. Bang. Bing. He indicated Blackie's hands twisting his foot, and he fixed it up. The precocious Blackie didn't always respect lights out altar. He'd found the nightly dice game played at a local restaurant. And he discovered another side to the famous doctor. Regularly, Blackie would be sent out late to a bootlegger's to buy a Mickey of whiskey. I used to feel son why. He'd drink the whole fucking bottle, no water, or nothing. Every night a bottle. One day in 1936 the bootlegger moved on to more and thirstier clients, Boomtown Val d'Or. And he wrote to Blackie. Told me I could come up here and dig gold and get into card games and, this and that. So, I jumped freight. It was a long way from the charred and bloodied ruins of an Armenian village. Others didn't come such a distance. In 1897, the year Blackie arrived in Canada, Paul Laframboise went to work in a Sudbury area lumber camp. He was 14 years old, with iron muscles, a quick mind, and driving ambition. The necessities of subsistence farming had kept Paul out of school regularly, but I was pretty good at everything, except geography and grammar, he recalls. He was to become one of Val d'Or's most feared street fighters and most inventive entrepreneurs. One of the men in the lumber camp had been a boxer, and he began training some of the hoys. We asked the contractor if we could build a gym, said I Laframboise about 60 years later, which they did, with the best logs. In the spring, though, we tore it down, and sold the logs. For brawling or business, the kid learned his lessons well. In his teens, he wandered to Windsor and into Michigan, later he worked underground at Kirkland Lake. In 1934 he was among the experienced miners picked to start driving the shaft at the great mine Tamaqua Gold. They were flown to the lake near the Sullivan Mine, staked in 1911 and later sold by Jim Sullivan. He'd been drinking too much, they say, when the deals were made. Years later, he died alone in his shack on the property. On top of millions of dollars in ore, he starved to death. Laframboise and his workmates packed their gear through the bush and past the cabins along the line Gabriel Commanda had cut, and up to the Lamaki property. In 18 months, they drove a 65-degree shaft down into the granite for 2,200 feet, 3 shifts around the clock, 7 OA shift. Their tents quickly evolved into Bourlamaque, the comparatively decorous company town that looked down its nose at the irreverent squatter-founded Val d'Or. In his 70s, Laframboise, ex-miner, contractor and brawler was back living about 100 yards from where he had started under canvas at Lamaki, superintendent of the big, 2-story mine boarding house. Another part of northern history were 3 young part Indian brothers, Leo, Gustave, Gus, and Tous, Sir, from Maniwaki. They caught gold fever in 1927 from an end-of-the-road prospector, Jack Clifford. Drunk, sick, and broke, Clifford ran into the boys and asked if they knew of a place he could find a bed. Like kids with a puppy, Tous was 10 years old, Gus 12, and Leo, over 6 feet and still growing, was 23, they took him home to mother. In the 2 weeks back to health there was lots of time to tell the boys yarns about gold hunting. Prospectors tell 2 kinds of stories, about others, who struck it rich, or about how they almost hit the mother lode. They don't talk about the odds being at least 1,000,000 to 1 against even discovering enough of a showing to win an option from some hopeful promoter, never mind making a mine. Old Clifford also drove the boys, all intelligent and tenaciously curious, a basic course in what to look for and what to do if you find it. Even poor people like themselves could play this game, because their grub stake was their ability to live off the land. So, when spring carn, they couldn't resist. With a borrowed canoe and little in the way of food or gear, they began a life of self-reliant survival that made all 3 into legendary bush travelers. The legendary Leo, rapidly getting rid of Onanza from some staking deal, once found it difficult to explain the concept of snowshoes to a Florida chorus line girlfriend. So he demonstrated their use, on a truckload of corn flakes, unloaded under the palms on the hotel grounds. These series seemed impervious to cold or tedium or hunger. Unfortunately, Big Leo, as handsome and as convincing as he was strong and tall, was sometimes equally insensible to any constraints of legality or ethics. The boy's first gold find was staked in his name because he was the only one of age, and he kept it to himself. The others got nothing from it until they restaked it after his death. When we left home in the spring we caught muskrat and beaver and whatever we can get, said Gus. Trolled from the canoe when we moved. We stay a little while and we fish a little while at Bark Lake, now Lac des Escorces, near Mont Laurier. We fished for sale, too, but we didn't get enough to buy steak. He laughed. About 10 cents a piece for pike and pickerel. The fish was moved out the bush roads in ice in a box buggy, and then by truck to market. What did their mother think of her sons, one of them only 9 years old, leaving home to live off the bush? Well, she likes to see us take a chance, but she was still worried for us. One thing Leo done later was to send some money to bring our mother and sister, Germaine, up here. He did that good anyhow. Germaine, who became a nurse, was a bush country legend in her own right. See Chapter 9. The usual route to Val d'Or was the gold fever one, from the west. It began in Ontario's minefield for Chick and Nelson Bidgood. They inherited the fever from their father, Fred, one of the founders of the Canadian Prospectors and Development Association. He had made a number of profitable discoveries, including 2 properties that became dividend-paying mines. He knew the high life of chauffeur-driven cars before ending up as a Sigma Mines watchman at Val d'Or. Chick fled the heavy hand of his father when he was 14 and attended the Haileybury School of Mines for a while, but much of his early learning was on the forest and river trails from older bushmen and prospectors. Self-taught, he reported for a mining paper, wrote a popular column, Bush Talk, and once even filled in as a local newspaper editor. One of his headlines, "Pimp picked up with blonde equipment." Nelson graduated from Haileybury School in 1925, he was much serious and conservative, and, ultimately, the more successful prospector and mining entrepreneur. With wry humor he recalls how, on graduation at 17, he was sent into the Abitibi bush in May to do hand-stealing on a claim staked by his father. 5 months later he headed back downriver to Amos, which passed for civilization. Founded in 1913 when the railway arrived there, Amos was originally a railway supply center for Quebecois farming colonists rather than a mine hunter, boomtown. It still had no dance hall, no liquor store, no theater. But a big good-looking lad coming out of nearly half a year in the bush might at least see a female face. And who knows, he might get on the train to somewhere and see the best-known gold rush of that year, Charlie Chaplin's new film. "When I got to Dad," he recalled, Pete Graham was there. He'd been prospecting and had made what sounded like a pretty promising discovery. He wanted to clear off some overburden, blast into a ridge, open a face, and had come low my father for help. So the old man sold me to Pete. Nelson chuckled. The old man sent me right back into the bush as soon as I got to Amos. We had to pack in from the water about 2.5 miles to Pete's property. We built a camp, tore the muck off the showing, hand-steeled it, and got back home December 23. Nelson continued to work in the Malartic area, usually south of Amos and west of the waiting Val d'Or boom, until 1928. And then for about a year he worked for Dominion explorers down in the territories, meaning the Arctic. And the day after I got back from the Yukon, my old man sent me prospecting with Billy Cram in the Opaska area. Nelson and Nina, the bright young Haileybury telephone operator he married in the spring of 1931, when they found out I was married, Nina said, they gave me the opportunity of quitting, were to be one of the first non-Indian couples to live in the area before there was a Val d'Or. They followed Nelson's father and the second of his 3 wives. Before that Nelson was hired as manager at the Moffat Hall mine at Kirkland Lake. My old man was the biggest shareholder. We sank a shaft to 550 feet. For a year I was manager, bookkeeper, geologist, engineer, and blacksmith. In 1933, when the Moffat Hall was shipping ore for smelting at Noranda, Nelson was back working as hoist man, firing his own boiler and running a gasoline compressor, for $3.50 a day. It was men like this who were making Canada one of the richest mineral resource countries in the world. Bushmen, miners, knowledgeable, tough jacks of all trades. The ones who combined rock savvy, sweat and muscle work, an ability in mining engineering and financing, made the history books. One of them was Nova Scotia-born Jim Norrie, a mining engineer with square jaw, thick neck, broad shoulders, and a bad case of gold fever. He made mines out of other men's finds on the fly-clouded, sweat-stinking spot, not from some promoter's office. He assayed and drilled and manhandled the way into Abitibi and helped develop the mines of Malartic in the west wing of the Val d'Or stage. In 1926, 18-year-old Nelson Bidgood was working his way up the creek south of huge Malartic Lake, where old-time prospectors, like Barb Sladen, Lee Coffins, Brian Kennedy, and Wilbur Goldie had reportedly made their finds. Nelson knew Norrie was there in the bush long before he saw him. The noise could out-rattle the giant northern pileated woodpecker. As Nelson's canoe knifed through a creek towards the racket, he finally saw Norrie. He and his crew were attempting to wrestle a 60-horsepower, locomotive-type steam engine up the embankment. The thing was about 30 feet long and almost 10 feet in diameter. He was trying to get it as close as he could to where his shack was, said Bidgood, still grinning at the memory of it. He had about a dozen men to help manhandle that massive thing, all of them running around screaming and hollering in French. And Nori was hollering louder than any of them, in English. I don't think he understood one word of French. And none of them knew English. It was Big Jim Nori's hands-on drive that killed him at the peak of an amazing career. In 1945 he walked 18 miles to his newest prospect in the Noranda area. Impatient to speed up the digging of some building foundations, he joined the laborers at work. After walking back to town, he wasn't feeling well, but waved off a doctor's advice to get to hospital. Heart failure. Dennis Agar contributed significantly to the development of Nori's mining wealth in Malartic. Agar's route to a sub-zero life under canvas had its unlikely genesis on the Caribbean island of Dominica. His middle name is Rose, a family name known to the world through Rose's lime juice cordial, made from the products of the family's plantation. A tall, slimly erect, distinguished-looking man in his 80s, he lives in Ottawa with his classically gracious wife. It was a long way from the islands to the Canadian Malartic property. His first goldfield home was in a unique two-story mine office and assay building erected by the ingenious Nori in the 1920s, made from the wooden boxes in which explosives had been shipped. As assistant mine manager, Agar got $150 a month and board, fairly healthy for 1933. But I worked until I couldn't stand up any longer every night for better part of a year before I finally got an assistant to do the assaying work. Agar, orphaned very young, attended private schools in England and the US. His inheritance paid off family debts and put him through MIT. Then he was on his own. And one of his first jobs was a pick and a shovel in an Arizona copper mine. After the crash of 1929, the price of copper dropped to 10 cents a pound. The mine closed and Agar was out of a job. He was taken on by the Pennsylvania Reading Coal and Iron Co., which was in a dirty battle in ties 60 dirty collieries against competition from electricity and natural gas and increasingly organized miners. Everywhere, plants were abandoned to thrown rocks by kids and bitter men. The freight trains became the transports of the hopeless and the homeless. But up there in Canada beyond the rails and dirt roads, industries, stores, homes, bridges, and hopes, were growing. Like the Bushman, Mike Middow, the Russian Kid, the Bidgoods, the Series, the Sears, many others were finding their way north to make the city of Val d'Or the forest wanderers' home base.